Okay. I'm sorry, I'm going to just stop this for a minute. Okay. And now I'm going to go back. Hello. Let's begin. Welcome to all of you to the October meeting of the League of Women Voters Lunch and Learn program. We're delighted you're joining us today. And I know we're going to learn a lot about Nebraska's nonpartisan legislature. So I'd like to ask all of you, except the two members of the program, to please turn off your audio and video now so that we can focus on the speakers. And we will be using the chat function for questions and comments. So please type your remarks there. I will try to keep an eye on it in case there's something that needs to be asked right away. And otherwise, we will wait until the speakers are ready to take questions. So our first presenter today is Nathan Leach. He's the founder and executive director of Nonpartisan Nebraska, a relatively new nonprofit that's devoted to promoting and preserving nonpartisanship in the unicameral. A native of Kearney, Nathan is passionate about the advantages of Nebraska's unique legislature and dedicated to helping people learn more about it. And that's his goal in speaking to us today. And we are delighted to have with us also unicameral Speaker Mike Hilgers. Senator Hilgers, like an attorney, was elected to represent District 21 in Northwest Lincoln in 2016 and re-elected in 2020. When the legislature reorganized in 2021, his colleagues elected him Speaker. In that leadership role, he's had lots of opportunities. The workings and the effects of the legislature's nonpartisan structure and rules. And we are really pleased that he's able to join Nathan today in a conversation about nonpartisanship. So Nathan's going to get things started with a presentation, followed by a conversation with Senator Hilgers. So I will stop sharing my screen and we will let Nathan take it from here.
Awesome. Thank you, Charlene. I really appreciate that. Just give me one moment while I turn this on. Share. Can you see that all right?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being a part of this call. I'm especially thankful to the League of Women Voters for hosting this event and to Speaker Mike Hilgers for joining us for this presentation. Like Charlene said, my name is Nathan Leach. I live in Kearney and am the founder and executive director of Nonpartisan Nebraska, a nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting and expanding nonpartisan government in Nebraska. Nonpartisan Nebraska was incorporated a year ago with the help of a politically diverse group of Nebraskans who came together with a common belief in the nonpartisan vision that former U.S. Senator George Norris had for our unicameral legislature. Our organization is dedicated to educating Nebraskans about the history of our unicameral and how it works. We believe that the historic rules, customs, and procedures of the Nebraska Unicameral Legislature provide a path for issue-by-issue collaboration amongst lawmakers, emphasize the influence a single legislator can have without top-down partisan leadership controlling the process, and result in better representation for the people of Nebraska. We believe that the people, not the parties, should control our legislature. Today, I want to focus on a question that many ask when they hear about our nonpartisan legislature. What does it actually mean to be nonpartisan? This is an incredibly important question, and it's often misunderstood by the general public, and even more recently, some elected officials in the legislature itself. To answer that question, we have to first define what we actually mean by nonpartisan. If we're talking about a legislature in which state senators have no party affiliation and are completely isolated from the influence of political parties, then I don't think we've ever had a nonpartisan legislature. Using this unrealistic and overly literal definition to define a nonpartisan legislature misconstrues how deliberative bodies work and the ideals of the populist movement that are at the foundations of the unicameral system in the first place. Before getting into this definition, I want to reflect on what really makes the unicameral so special. And to understand that, we have to understand how other legislatures work in relationship to political parties. One could argue that the political party's greatest expression of power is their institutionalization in state legislatures across the country, and especially in the United States Congress. This feat is accomplished through vast public acceptance, or perhaps ignorance, of their enormous impact on a single lawmaker's ability to do their job. Political caucuses, which are made up and controlled by partisan leadership, are more than just harmless organizing tactics for effective government. Their role in the legislative process is profound and deeply entrenched. Most people would expect lawmakers to focus diligently on serving the people who elected them, a service that would supersede the political goals of a national or state party platform. The reality is that lawmakers who put people over party are faced with potential devastating repercussions, and it's usually considered political suicide to do so. In partisan legislatures across the country, lawmakers who vote against their own party and instead vote in a way they believe to be in the best interest of their constituents can lose the ability to advocate for their constituents at all due to being stripped of their chairmanships, committee assignments, or becoming politically shunned by their partisan peers. This is usually a death sentence for political leaders who aspire for higher office or leadership positions within the legislative body. This system is permitted only because the institutional rules within those legislatures allow it. Nebraska, the nation's only unicameral state legislature, is also the only legislature that does not allow this kind of institutional response to lawmakers voting against their party and even engaging in inflammatory debate. Former Senator Ernie Chambers was a perfect example of this kind of behavior. He displayed not just gifted oratory and often controversial oratory, but his actions put on display the radical nature of a nonpartisan legislature. The fact that he was never kicked out of the body by his peers or even reprimanded presents an impressive display of reverence for the nonpartisan and institutional rules of the unicameral by lawmakers. And of course, any lawmaker in their right mind would be wary of being on the wrong side of Ernie Chambers. The rules that govern the Nebraska legislature provide protections against a reprimand that would alter the ability of lawmakers to do their job, that is, to represent their constituents. Even former Senator Bill Kittner, who resigned in face of the threat of expulsion in 2017 after using a state computer to engage in cybersex, did not lose his physical office space, staff, or committee assignments, because doing so, according to then chair of the executive board, former Senator Bob Christ, would deprive his constituents of proper representation. Of course, Kittner later resigned before being expelled. Leadership's role in our legislature is designed to be administrative. This is in sharp contrast to partisan legislatures. Unlike in many legislatures, the speaker cannot remove people from committees. They do not select the chair of committees. They do not have a role in selecting committee membership at all, and they do not decide where bills are referenced to. These decisions are all done in a transparent and democratic process. I will be explaining much of that process later on in this presentation. There are several factors that came into play which helped create a culture of institutional respect for nonpartisanship in our unicameral. Taking a step back, it's important to realize that in one fell swoop, voters in 1934 enacted both a unicameral amendment and a provision that lawmakers would be elected through nonpartisan primaries and elections that did not include party affiliation on the ballot. This meant that all candidates would compete in one open primary in which all candidates would compete in one primary in which the top two vote getters would face off in the general election, regardless of their party affiliation. This reform was led by former US Senator George Norris, who enjoyed both a massive amount of public respect and a populist streak. Norris led the charge in the United States House of Representatives for rules reforms that decentralized control from partisan leadership. His understanding of rules and the populist idea that government should be for the people and not for the party had a major influence on the first unicameral legislature in 1937. Norris played a major role in the adoption of the unicameral amendment and even had the remarkable privilege of addressing the legislature as a US senator for the unicameral's maiden session, even missing the first day of the US Senate session to do so. Switching from a partisan bicameral with partisan elections to a unicameral with nonpartisan elections was like switching from Monopoly to chess. The whole board and all of its rules had changed. The newly elected members of the 1937 unicameral had to create entirely new rules for the institution. No other US state had a unicameral to borrow procedure from. They were in uncharted territory. And as a result, they were in a position to dramatically alter the institution and adopt an entirely new rulebook, a rulebook that has evolved and changed, but is fundamentally the same one we use today. But it's important to note that nothing in the 1934 constitutional amendment required the legislature to adopt nonpartisan rules. There was no constitutional requirement that the Nebraska legislature be nonpartisan, aside from the nonpartisan elections we use. The only protection against formal partisan control of the Nebraska legislature is the institutional rules of the legislature itself, the lawmakers who serve in it, and public support for nonpartisanship. Going back to the definition of a nonpartisan legislature, the definition I like to use to define a nonpartisan government is this. A nonpartisan government is one that does not give deference to political parties in elections, laws, or decision-making processes. Parties are treated just like any other private organization. Although members of a nonpartisan legislature or other elected body may be associated with a political party, the system of rules and traditions adopted by that body allow officials to prioritize and act in the best interest of their constituents rather than their political party. To describe what influences nonpartisanship in our Nebraska legislature, I like to think of three areas or pillars that work to keep the institution nonpartisan. The first is our nonpartisan legislative elections. The second is our one-house unicameral structure. And the third is the rules, customs, and traditions that the legislature has used since becoming a unicameral in 1937. Let's start out by talking about that first pillar, our nonpartisan elections. Our state is the only state in the union that uses nonpartisan open primary elections for legislative races. And we've used that system since we placed it in our Constitution when we switched to a one-house body in 1937. When lawmakers run for office in Nebraska, they compete in an open primary in which all candidates run on one ballot, just like school board or city council. Then the top two vote getters, regardless of party, compete in the general election. The party affiliation of a candidate is publicly available and usually well known, but it is not printed on the ballot. The idea is that voters vote for a person, not the party. By allowing all voters and candidates the opportunity to participate equally in legislative elections, our elections are more competitive and provide all voters, regardless of party, the chance to be equally heard. Candidates can't just go knocking on the doors of voters with one party registration, but have to compete for votes from everyone, both in the primary and general election. This makes a lot of sense, especially in districts where the population is predominantly made up of one political party, which in the case of most states would mean the election would be unofficially decided in the primary. Our system can allow the most popular, not the most partisan, candidates to proceed to the general election and become a state senator. Another major influence in how nonpartisanship works in our legislature is due to its size and unicameral structure. By having a small chamber of only 49 members, the smallest legislature in the country, lawmakers are more accountable to the people. The lawmaking process is linear. Citizens don't have to follow two competing pieces of legislation and two different legislative chambers, and often have two entirely different rules and processes in each. Instead, there is just one group of lawmakers to watch and follow. Having a small body also allows lawmakers to have professional staff, more resources, and more independence. Imagine trying to have a nonpartisan legislature made up of hundreds of lawmakers. The more individuals involved in an organization, the more necessary it is for a small group of those individuals to control the process, and the more likely it is that partisanship would be used to organize interests and govern the process. The last pillar, and the one I'm going to explain in the most detail, is our legislative rules. Starting in 2019, the legislative rules have been adopted by the legislature at the beginning of the biannual session. Prior to that, the rules were adopted at the beginning of every session in January. The ability of the legislature to adopt their own rules of procedure is provided in the Nebraska State Constitution in Article 3, Section 10, a constitutional right that every state legislature in the country, as well as the United States Congress, has. This is a very important provision that helps ensure proper separation of powers. It also means that one legislature cannot force a future legislature to follow a specific legislative process or rule. Imagine, for example, that in January of 2004, a Democratic majority of the legislature became aware that they were likely to become the minority in the next session in 2005. The Democrats, wanting to preserve their political power, write a law that stipulates that all committees of the legislature must be co-chaired by both Republicans and Democrats, regardless of how many Republicans or Democrats there are in the body. They also stipulate, through state statute, that all bills must be co-signed by a Democrat before they can be referred to a committee. The Democratic governor signs the bill into law, and the new legislature in 2005 meets. Are they required to follow these statutes? Of course not, because the state constitution provides the legislature with the right to determine its own rules of proceedings, and constitutional rights supersede state statute. Obviously, the legislature can place legislative procedures and rules within state statute, but the adopted legislative rules take precedence over state statute because they derive from a constitutional right. In fact, even customs and unwritten rules that the legislature may use or decide not to use can override statutory provisions according to Mason's Manual of Legislative Procedure. It's easy to misunderstand just how much power there is in the rules of the legislature. For example, back in 2016, then State Senator John Morante introduced a bill to create an independent redistricting committee. He was able to break a filibuster, but the bill was vetoed by the governor, and he decided not to pursue a veto override. What frustrated me the most about that bill being vetoed is the idea that the bill could have been submitted as a rules amendment rather than a statutory proposal. There is absolutely nothing in the Constitution that prohibits the legislature from creating a special committee of non-lawmakers who could undertake redistricting and propose their plan to the full legislature for approval. So long as all constitutional requirements were met, it falls well within the unicameral's right to determine their own rules of procedure. Understanding legislative procedure is more than just reading the adopted rulebook. Parliamentary procedure is a form of common law and one of the oldest forms of democracy. The processes we use to debate and make laws in the United States are primarily based on the rules that the United States Senate and House of Representatives adopted early on in our republic. And those rules were adopted based on the orderly rules used by colonial governments, which in turn were taken and adapted from the procedures used by the House of Commons in the United Kingdom. Codifying parliamentary law is a lot like how the English language is codified in the dictionary. The dictionary is always being updated because people don't learn language from dictionaries, they learn language from each other. And we are always changing. When you learn parliamentary procedure from a parliamentary guide like Mason's Manual of Legislative Procedure or Robert's Rules of Order, they generally do a good job of explaining the importance of recognizing them as guides, not rigid legal processes, to be used and adapted by individual groups. It is important to understand that parliamentary procedure is a tool for order, and those rules are not arbitrary, but based on a consistent set of principles. I bring this up partly because I'm a parliamentary procedure nerd, but also to emphasize just how important and multifaceted legislative rules can be. Unfortunately, the legislature has yet to provide a rules amendment process that recognizes the importance of allowing full public participation, particularly adequate public notice, which is essential to ensuring the public can provide research and parliamentary assistance when rules amendments are discussed once every 2 years. The first adopted rules of the unicameral were 19 pages long. Today's legislative rulebook is 92 pages. Obviously, with the time we have today, I can't go into detail about every legislative rule, but rather I'd like to focus on some of the key provisions that stand out as an exception when compared to other partisan legislatures in the country. The first rule, and one of the most important and perhaps controversial, is how lawmakers elect leadership in the body. Since the first session in 1937, lawmakers have used a ballot vote to elect senators to leadership positions. Originally, the only two leadership positions elected by the legislature were the office of Speaker and the chair of the Committee on Committees. Committee chairs were not elected by ballot vote, but rather chosen by the committee members themselves during the first session, and then were chosen by the Committee on Committees until approximately 1973, when the entire legislature began electing the chairs of standing committees. Likewise, when the executive board of the Legislative Council was created around 1951, the body began to elect the chair and vice chair of the executive board by ballot at that time as well. Sometimes you'll hear some senators referencing the 1970s as when the legislature began using the so-called secret ballot, usually pointing this out to shed doubt on its connection to the nonpartisan unicameral design. But in fact, the 1970s was simply the time the full legislature began electing committee chairs to begin with. Looking back at the legislative journals will show you that the unicameral has never used a roll call vote for any leadership position since its maiden session in 1937. This is important because using a ballot vote for leadership elections encouraged lawmakers to vote for the most experienced and capable leaders rather than simply voting for leadership based on party affiliation. To some Nebraskans, this may sound alarming. Why would we allow politicians to cast secret votes? The reality is that casting a ballot for a leadership position is not the same as casting a vote on public policy, especially since committee chairs and other leadership positions in the unicameral are intended to be apolitical and administrative roles rather than political ones. Given how small the body is, if we were to use a roll call vote for leadership elections, there is little doubt that the political parties and other senators would take note of how lawmakers vote and punish or even reward senators based on how they voted. It would very rapidly turn the legislature into a de facto partisan body. It's also worth noting that many legislatures, and even in the United States Congress, the leaders of the legislative body are chosen behind closed doors, usually by use of a secret ballot, by the political caucuses. Then, after using a ballot vote, the members cast their vote publicly to confirm their partisan allegiances. In turn, the elected leaders of the body appoint the chairs of committees from amongst the majority party, solidifying partisan control. It may appear more transparent, but the reality is far from it. In 2017, the use of the ballot vote for leadership positions became so contentious that the legislature took nearly 1/3 of the session filibustering the adoption of their legislative rules. I happened to be living in Lincoln at the time, waiting to be shipped off to basic training for the Army. And so I did the only thing a 21-year-old could do who cares deeply about the legislature. I went before committee after committee and protest testified on each bill on the agenda to put into the record my frustration that the legislature could not adopt its nonpartisan rules. I made a bit of a fool of myself in the process, but what else was I going to do? The rules are technically germane to every bill. I strongly believe that of all the nonpartisan rules we have at our disposal, having lawmakers vote by ballot for the best candidate without fear of political retaliation is one of the most essential and endangered in our rulebook. The next rule that is unique to Nebraska is our caucus system. Rather than caucus based on political affiliation, like every other legislature, lawmakers are split into 3 caucuses loosely based off the 3 congressional districts in the state. These groups then select from amongst themselves representatives who serve on what's called the Committee on Committees, which has the job of proposing the list of members for committees in the legislature. The legislature can either approve or reject the proposal, but cannot amend it, or if it is rejected, it must be rewritten and proposed again for an up or down vote. Committees are composed equally of representatives from these congressional districts or geographical caucuses rather than from the majority parties. This is unique because in most states, the composition of committees is worked out between the leaders of the 2 parties and is usually centered around decisions from the speaker and majority or minority leaders. Another important element to our process in Nebraska is the emphasis we place on our committee process. Every bill introduced in the Nebraska legislature has a public hearing in which anyone can testify. Leadership cannot pick and choose which bills get a public hearing. Also worth noting is that the speaker does not refer bills to committee. In most legislatures, the elected leader has the power to refer bills, or even choose not to refer bills at all, to whichever committee they choose. Oftentimes, this allows partisan leadership to refer bills they don't like to committees that will not advance them. Here in Nebraska, bills are referred to committee by the executive board, which is made up of representatives from each of the caucuses, and their decision as to which committee a bill goes to can be contested and overruled by the entire legislature. This emphasizes the idea that legislative leadership can be held accountable by the entire membership of the legislature. Another interesting rule that I took a deep dive into last year is the rule that allows senators to amend the agenda. The ability of lawmakers to change the order of bills on the agenda has existed since the unicameral's first session. According to the legislative journals from 1937 until 1944, bills were reported to general file as they came out of committee, and only a majority vote of the legislature could alter such order. This was a dramatic departure from the norm that bills be scheduled for debate by partisan leadership. It seems that the original framers of our rules understood that fairness and adherence to rules of procedure would protect lawmakers from overzealous leadership or partisan factions. Allowing a majority of lawmakers to control the agenda was a key component to decentralization and democratic proceedings. Naturally, having too little control over which bills came up on general file was a hard way to legislate. So in 1945, the legislature created the Committee on Order and Arrangement. This committee, made up of committee chairs, could alter the agenda with the approval of the legislature. Note that the speaker was excluded from this committee until 1967. And soon after adding the speaker to the committee, the legislature promptly granted the office full authority to modify the order of bills in 1971 until adding the requirement of approval by the executive board a year later. Meanwhile, a majority vote was all it took to change the order of bills until 1979, when the current 3/5 rule was adopted. Finally, soon after, in 1981, the legislature formalized the speaker's responsibility of preparing the agenda and sharing said agenda no less than 1 day prior to the day for which it was prepared. This rule has remained unchanged since that time. This was a tricky rule to track down, as it's not a rule that is recognized by Robert's Rules of Order or Mason's Manual of Legislative Procedure. These are just some of many different rules and processes that we use in the legislature that set our system apart from other legislative bodies in the United States. We provide individual senators a remarkable number of rights and privileges in our unicameral process. Any member may almost always introduce whichever motions they see fit. They can introduce as many amendments as they want. They can even filibuster legislation to their heart's desire. And often, even though our current legislature is dominated by one political party, senators from across the political spectrum tend to work together to build coalitions either for or against legislation that do not necessarily correspond with their political affiliation. Just because you are a member of one political party or the other does not mean that your party will determine your effectiveness in representing your constituents in the Nebraska Unicameral. Will our nonpartisan system survive in today's hyper-partisan world? Many of those who have watched the legislature over the past 10 to 15 years have noticed a sharp increase in partisanship within and around the legislature. One of the primary reasons I started Nonpartisan Nebraska is because I believe that we as Nebraskans need to start having serious and honest conversations about what makes our legislature nonpartisan to begin with, what is influencing the legislative process to become more partisan, and how we can preserve and, if necessary, adapt our unicameral process to ensure that it continues to work for and by the people and not for and by political parties. One of the challenges about starting an organization like Nonpartisan Nebraska is that so many involved in politics today, especially the most partisan Democrats and Republicans, are often so focused on winning short-term political gains. There are probably just as many partisan Democrats in this state who support nonpartisanship as there are partisan Republicans who oppose it, not because they understand the populism behind it, but because they realize it gives the minority an opportunity to participate in our legislature in a way they could never in a traditional partisan bicameral. If you look at this process from a purely partisan perspective, you're not wrong. But when you take a step back and consider the long-term advantages of keeping our process nonpartisan, you might consider, for example, the reality that as population moves to the east, more and more rural senators will depend on our nonpartisan system to ensure they can properly represent Western Nebraska. I believe that a good governmental process in the long run will lead to better public policy overall. Also, a warning that we should all remember in politics, and especially when it comes to legislative procedure, an overzealous majority today can easily turn into a whimpering minority tomorrow. Our legislature is changing. It is unquestionably becoming more partisan. The question we must ask ourselves is whether we can come together and respond fast and strong enough to erect adequate safeguards that will protect our Nebraska unicameral experiment and ensure that the nonpartisan structure of our legislature will remain strong and last another 80 years into the future. I believe we can. In closing, I have a couple of resources I wanted to share. Our website is currently undergoing some construction, so our URL, npnebraska.org, will direct you to our Facebook page. If you're interested in joining our email list, I have a link provided and I will share it to the chat list. If you would like to discuss with me anything in the presentation today off the call, please feel free to shoot me an email at that email address, and I will get back to you as soon as possible. The Nebraska Legislative website is also a tremendous resource to those who are new to watching and learning about the legislature. There you can find your current state senators, find out about bills that have been introduced, and explore and find more information about the legislature. To those of you who might be interested in the history of our legislative rules, Nonpartisan Nebraska has uploaded PDF copies of all the legislative rule books from 1937 until today. You can find them on our Google Drive. This is an excellent resource when trying to figure out when rules first started appearing in our rulebook, and by using Control Find, you can quickly access how the language of a specific rule might have changed over time. Lastly, if you want to know more about the history of our Nebraska Unicameral, I suggest reading a copy of Charlene Barron's book, One House. It is extremely well written and enlightening, and does a much better job than I in explaining the populist history and evolution of our one house legislature. I'll put all these links in the chat for those who are interested. And with that, we can turn it over.
Okay, Nathan, if you'll stop sharing your screen, we will ask Senator Hilgers to turn his video on, and I will try to spotlight both of you so that you are more obvious to the group. Okay, there we go. All right, take it away.
So, Speaker Hilgers, thank you so much for being on the call. And to those, I think it's interesting to point out that Speaker Hilgers and I first met in 2017 when I was living in his district. And so you've watched me email you long emails about the legislative rules, go before these committees and protest testify. And one thing that I've always appreciated about you is that you always seem to read those emails and actually care a little bit about the legislative process. And I've always appreciated that about you. I guess my first question to you, and then we can just kind of open it up for some dialogue and then open it up to some Q&A, is coming into the legislature in 2017 with how difficult that time was. How has your impression of the legislature changed, not just as a state senator, but now being in the position that you have as speaker and sort of a custodial position over the legislature as an institution?
Well, thanks for that, Nathan. I really appreciate that. I think you and I first met when I was chair of the Rules Committee in 2017. And so a lot of your protest testifying was in front of that committee, in fact. And so it's been neat to watch your development in this particular area. And I always appreciate people who dive into the rules. And you're one of frankly, the few people who do, especially outside of the body. And I've always been a believer that good rules and good process helps lead to good policy, in addition to good people. And so I appreciate that interest. And I'm glad to see so many people on this particular call who are interested in the rules and process of the legislature, because I think it plays such an important role in the outcome. It's a great question you asked. And I think one of the ways I would respond to that is when I came in initially, I didn't fully appreciate in a way that I do now the importance and power of relationships and everything that goes along with good relationships. And that means open communication, the ability to authentically listen, the ability to earn and gain trust by doing what you say that you are going to do, not to give people surprises that you can at least help. I think that's an element in good, good day-to-day life skills, to be quite honest, whether it's in business or, in a church or organization or family. And it's one that I think in some ways is intuitive to think in politics. I think in our legislative body in particular, it doesn't have that partisan internal infrastructure that you described in your presentation. Relationships and the ability to develop good relationships almost matter more than anything else. And so I think that's something that I kind of knew coming in, but I think in 5 years serving in the body, that is maybe the number one thing that I realize is maybe one of the most powerful ways for a senator to have influence and to impact good legislation in the body.
One thing I was quite impressed with, and I'm sure there's people on the call who might disagree about the recent redistricting process, but I was just watching from outside. I was very impressed with the way that you handled the body in that. I, just coming from a kind of a parliamentarian's point of view, I haven't really seen you make any rulings as the speaker that seem to be unfair or overly partisan, and I really appreciate that. What do you think has been some of the biggest challenges that you've faced as speaker, especially as, I mean, political scientists kind of look at the legislature and say that we're becoming more partisan. Do you sense that as the speaker?
Well, I appreciate that comment, Nathan. And I would say, and I think it's interesting, I wrote down when you were in the middle of your presentation about 4 or 5 different instances where you pointed out that a speaker in Nebraska does not have this power, that speakers in other states have tremendous power compared in a lot of ways to the speaker in Nebraska. That's not to say that the speaker doesn't have influence here. But when it comes to making good decisions, fairness, fair notice, and treating people equally is, I think, incredibly important for a speaker. And there's one slide that you had that I think is really important to flag for any future speaker or anyone watching this, which is the legislature there are checks and balances on speaker activity, one of which is setting the agenda, changing the agenda. And so if you are not fair, if you don't treat people the right way, provide fair notice and do those things, the body has an ability to react to that. There's no dictatorial powers. And so I think on the merits, it's the right thing to do to be fair to people, regardless of the particular issue, and to treat people evenly and fairly, no matter what their ideology is. But there's also a very strong check and balance that the body has to ensure that happens. So as speaker, I would say my reflection is that and this is partly from my litigation background. So I've served, I've worked in a private practice, litigation practice, trial lawyer is my training and background. And I've seen judges act that's what I deal on a day-to-day basis. And so judges, a good legislative process, in the courtroom, one of the things that I've learned is, it was always interesting to me that you've got 2 lawyers who are opposing sides who literally, almost in every case, are paid. Someone is paid money to fight with the other side. And it's inherently antagonistic. I have sued you, and I now have an advocate who I'm paying to fight with you. And I've noticed that in Nebraska in particular, as compared to some other bars, that there's actually a lot of collegiality, and there's a lot of relationship building, even amongst adversaries. Some of my closest friends in Nebraska are people I've been on the other side. And I'm coming back to your question on the speaker in a second. And when I reflected on that, what I realized was there are a couple elements that I think are really important that have driven a lot of my philosophy and methodology as speaker. Number one is, I think people need to provide fair notice. You need to give people heads up and notice and eliminate surprises. And I noticed as speaker that a lot of the friction in the body was oftentimes caused not by issues or even personalities, is when people were surprised. Maybe they were surprised by the bill that got put up on the agenda that was very contentious the next day. They didn't feel like they had an opportunity to be prepared. Maybe it was by some procedural device or some shenanigans that felt maybe fair play if there was some notice provided, but if there was a surprise, or if the speaker made some sort of surprise, said something out of the ordinary, that would create friction, or the lack of proactive communication. So I see all those things in the litigation courtroom sphere, and I try to take as much of that as to be speaker as possible. So if you watch the legislature, I know many of the people on this call do, you'll often see people moving around, and maybe if you're there in person, you'll see me moving around, communicating with both sides on a particular issue, no matter what it is. If it's a controversial, perceived conservative issue like a gun bill, or controversial perceived progressive issues, say medical marijuana, I think a good speaker works very hard on both sides to communicate throughout debate, in advance of debate, letting people know when the debate's going to be, letting people know what the issues are, and then communicating throughout to make sure that they understand what you're doing. They have an opportunity to be heard if they feel like you're not making a procedural call that they feel is the right one. And I think when you do that, even if they view maybe on the merits you're for the bill or the other, they can separate that from someone who's there to task with to make sure that the process. So I've really learned from the litigation side on how to do it and be friends with your adversaries and to keep tensions low. Some of these issues are very contentious in the first instance. Why add more with unnecessary surprises, the feeling that people aren't being heard, or lack of good communication?
I appreciate that. And I think, I won't name any names, but I think just watching the differences between speakers we've had in the past more recently and in the way that you've handled the legislature, there's a very apparent change in how the body seems to be conducting itself. And that's just a perspective as an outsider who just watches it from the screen, of course. So we have a couple questions here. I'm going to start with the term limit question because I'm very curious about your perspective on that. What role have, and this is from Charlene Behrens, but what role have term limits played in making the unicameral more partisan?
Well, it's a great question. And Professor Behrens, I would be remiss if I missed the opportunity to thank her for her friendship over the years as another one of my constituents. Nathan, I know you're not there in my district anymore, but Professor has been, and I think continues to be now. So I've always appreciated her perspective and both of you, your willingness to reach out. I think term limits has had two different impacts, many different impacts, but I'll focus on two. One is a loss of institutional norms. You pointed out, Nathan, in your presentation, the importance of tradition and norm building. A lot of what we do, based on, as evidenced by the large size of our rule book, is rule-based, but a lot of what we do is not. And using those rules or not using those rules is very norm-based. And those are the types of things that get passed on and get built up within a culture, hopefully a positive culture that you want to be able to sustain. And over time with term limits, if there's not an apparatus, and there really hasn't been historically in the legislature since term limits at least, to take those, to build that culture in the first instance and then replicate it across legislative generations, you lose out on things. Some of those things are not partisan, but I'll give you one example of something that you'll hear the old timers say, well, we used to do and now we don't do, and maybe we're starting to do again. And that actually is IPP bills in the legislature, in the committees. And so it used to be, before I was there in 2017, some years back, I don't know precisely when, it was a fairly common occurrence for senators to IPP bills in committee. So they would indefinitely postpone. I'm sure everyone on this call knows what that term means, but basically kill a bill. When I came in 2017, that actually was not a common occurrence at all. In fact, it almost never happened. And it started to get reintroduced this year. And it's not necessarily a bad or a good thing, but when it got reintroduced and it hadn't been in place for a number of years, it actually, some people took it personally, because when you were creating a new norm out of the blue and it wasn't communicated, in some instances wasn't communicated in advance, it felt like people were being personally singled out and their bills were personally being singled out. So it actually created some friction because we lost those norms across legislative generations. And I could come up with 24 examples. And that isn't about partisan or not, but it is about good process and notice and understanding and not personalizing things. If people understand that the basis of a decision is rule-based, norms-based, this is how we've done it, and not personally, it helps keep those relationships intact, which I think is one of the most important things to having a successful legislature. It also helps create and build trust. So one thing we've lost is institutional norms. The other thing is, we've lost the ability to generate long-term relationships and work together. When there are a number of senators so for instance, in my class, I'll serve with my entire time in the legislature. Those individuals I'll have great relationships with. There are some senators who I only serve with for 2 years. And there will be other senators in my last 2 years here where I will only serve with them for a brief amount of time. It's not a lot of time to develop trust and to develop real good working relationships. So I think when you break down, it's really that's not really about partisanship. I think so much of it is about the relationship building. When you lose relationships and you lose norms, both of which are impacted by term limits, I just think you make it more likely that you're going to have those interpersonal disputes and more friction. And that, more than anything, breaks down a lot of the legislative process.
And that's what just talking to different political scientists, when we look at when the polarization is really started, it really started when we enacted term limits. And of course, there's all sorts of different factors. One question, and I think I'm very curious what your thoughts are on this, are the recent huge increase in the cost of legislative elections in Nebraska. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it used to be that, a relatively normal person could raise money and run for the legislature. But now we're talking about just hundreds of thousands of dollars to run for the legislature. And of course, that means you have to get money from different groups, and you're more accountable to the political parties, and the political parties are now recruiting people. Do you think that we'll be able to find a way to fix that issue, or is that something that you think we just have to live with, or are you willing to live with as a senator personally?
Well, that's a great question, and let me approach this from two different perspectives. So one is why it is that the number of dollars have come up, have increased so significantly, and I think you could trace it back to one very clear thing, which is the United States Supreme Court's decision under the Roberts Court to find unconstitutional a campaign finance regulatory scheme in Arizona that was very similar to what was then on the books in Nebraska, which was the Campaign Finance Limitation Act. That act said that you would have specific limits on your, you could choose to put limits on your own spending. And what that meant was if your opponent went over the spending caps, you would get dollar for dollar additional contributions from the state in order to match it. The Supreme Court, United States Supreme Court determined that was unconstitutional. And then that was just not enforced here in Nebraska. And ever since then, you can see the increase in the expenditure on campaigns across legislative races, and every cycle it seems to be an increase. So I don't think, although it's interesting to be able to tease out causation there. There very well could be a term limits issue as well, because when individuals have been around for 16 years and maybe they don't tend to be challenged, I'm not quite sure. I do know that there's a direct link to the unconstitutionality of that particular act. But I do want to make a point about partisanship, which I think sometimes gets lost in some of this discussion. My anecdotal perspective is that the political parties as such, Republican Party, Democratic Party, actually themselves do not have significant influence within the legislature. And I mean that, and I judge that in one particular way, which is my sense of whether or not they are actively, as parties, qua parties, communicating with senators to encourage them or lobby them to vote one way or the other. I don't think I have ever been called by a Republican Party official on a bill to vote for a tax cut. And actually, I would say, I don't think I can ever recall a Democratic colleague of mine saying that they had been contacted by a Democratic Party official. I think both parties largely as parties stay out. I will say what the partisanship, though, is in my view, what I've experienced is of a different sort, which is this spun up national political environment that treats politics more like a sport. And I think you see people who really, who kind of communicate that way and lobby it that way. I think that's where some of the partisanship comes from, and not so much from the parties. But I will say the players who have the biggest influence are not partisan at all. I mean, if you think about the Farm Bureau or the ACLU, or the state chamber or the Nebraska State Teachers Union, those are very influential entities, both on the campaign side and the lobbying side, or maybe not the ACLU. I'm sorry, they don't do that, but within the lobby, and they are not partisan entities. And so I would say the last thing I would say. So I promised 2 points. So let me give you a third. One of the weaknesses of term limits, and by the way, as a dad of 4 little kids and with a law practice, very busy law practice, it is very difficult to see me having some sort of Dave Landis, career like Dave Landis or someone like that who's like 30 years in the legislature. Is very difficult. But one of the impacts of term limits is that institutionally, it's really weakened a lot of the strength of the legislature, because you have a lot of that institutional knowledge walk out the door. And we actually don't pay our staff all that much relative to other private opportunities. And so what you see are really good staff walk out the door and senators walk out the door. And so it weakens the institutional overall, which then allows some of these other forces, I think, to come to bear.
And I want to respond to that, because I think a lot of, some of these solutions, you can talk about major civic reforms, and Nonpartisan Nebraska wants to have conversations about how those civic reforms might help isolate the legislature from, we're calling it partisanship, but some of it's just making sure the legislature is working right. We're talking a lot more about process than we are partisanship or nonpartisanship. But like even talking about how much staff are paid. When I was working in Arizona in the state Senate, like all of your staff was appointed by the majority or the minority staff. It all came through the political parties. And so Nebraska does some things that are really unique in terms of giving every state senator their own office. Some senators have up to 3 members of staff if they're a committee chair. I honestly think that if we can build trust and amongst all senators, regardless of their political party, and say that, as Nebraskans, we want to make our legislature work well, that we can find some common ground and some common sense ways to isolate and ensure that our process works. And, we may need, and I personally think that we should have conversations about using things like whether we use open primaries for all state elections, or we use ranked choice voting, or have an independent redistricting committee, or find some ways to curb some of the money in politics. All of those things are worthwhile conversations too. But also there's some really easy stuff we could do. There's some simple rules amendments that we might be able to find to really make this process work more. But we have to be willing to talk with each other. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so grateful that you were willing to be on this call, Mr. Speaker, is because you're a really conservative guy. And you're known as, one of those more conservative senators, but being able to be on a call with people who might not have that same perspective in an organization that is trumpeting, the gospel of nonpartisanship, I think that says a lot about your character, and it says a lot about the Nebraska legislature as an institution. So I really appreciate you being on the call. And I know there's quite a few questions, but we're getting down to the last 3 minutes. So Professor Behrens, if you want to come on the call and maybe wrap it up for us, if there's some last minute questions you want to filter or ask, that would be great as well.
Thank you. I'm just wondering, because there are some really excellent comments and questions remaining, and we just don't have time, would you, Nathan, and maybe the senator also be willing to let these people email you their questions and respond to them as you can? If that's okay, Nathan's email, you want to type it into the chat, Nathan? Yes. And I just remembered this. I told people I was going to copy and paste some of this information into the chat as well. So let me do that. And Senator Hilgers, you can find his email on the legislative website. It's just mhilgers at leg.ne.gov, I believe. Is that correct?
Yes, I just put that into the chat.
Excellent. All right. That would be wonderful. This has been an amazing presentation. I think we've all learned a lot. I think it's important to keep in mind the things that Nathan pointed out, that some of the stuff that looks to us like not such a big deal, what's a rule here and there, can be a huge deal, and is a way that the founders of the unicameral and the first members really made sure that the nonpartisan ideal would be there. Now, that doesn't always play out beautifully day to day, but that the goals are still there. And a great deal of what's in the institution, or of the institution itself, shapes and makes those goals possible. Senator Hilgers is a very much a respecter of the unicameral as an institution. And I appreciate that. Let me add my comments to Nathan's. And it has been just really wonderful to hear from both of you today. So I think we're going to have to leave it at that. We're kind of running out of time, but thanks to all of you for attending. We had 81 people on the call at one point. So this is a popular topic. Let me remind all of you, let me just put this last slide up here with the League of Women Voters website on it.
While you do that, Professor, if I might just be able to say, I want to personally thank you and Nathan in particular. I think our politics, we have less and fewer and fewer people listening to one another. And what we need are more people who disagree, who can have thoughtful conversations built around mutual understanding and listening. And so I've always appreciated the two of you and your approach and allowing me to dialogue with you. And over the last several years, I've learned quite a bit, and I'm very grateful for that.
Thank you. We're going to stand in a circle and pat each other on the back here. This is great. We all appreciate this point of view. And let me remind all of you who are on the call today that once you have registered for a Lunch and Learn program through the League of Women Voters, you're on our mailing list, on our email list. You will get the reminders and the Zoom information for future meetings as they come up. If you have a friend who has not done that, has not registered and wants to, please remind them that they can do that. Go to the League of Women Voters website. There's the address down below. And there you can find out more about the League's work, which is important work done on the state level and national level. You can join there, and you can find recordings of previous programs. Just click on the Lunch and Learn schedule and videos on the right side of the page. For our November program on the 4th, the topic will be Lincoln's Vision for a Climate Smart Future. The program will be presented by Mickey Esposito, who's the Senior Policy Advisor to the Mayor of Lincoln. And then our December 9th program will be about Lincoln Airport's capital improvements. And we'll have the manager of the airport and several members of the airport authority with us that day. So we hope you'll join us in the future, and we hope you'll join the League of Women Voters. Again, thank you to Nathan Leach and Senator Hilgers, and everybody have a wonderful day.